Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. I acknowledge the traditional owners, the Tamaki tribes, so please excuse my pronunciation if I get this wrong. Ngāti Paua, Ngai Tai Te Wai o Hua, Ngāti Whatua o Orake, Ngāti Te Ata and Te Kawarau Amaki, and I pay my respects to your elders. It is a great honour to be here. In your custom, you expect your guests to announce their genealogy. I admire that custom, but it is not one that can easily be stated by an Aboriginal person from Australia. When I was a child, I had a strong sense of the difference between my people and the others who lived in town. I lived in a native camp on the outskirts of a tiny rural town in Queensland called Bollen. Eventually, our native camp on the banks of the river was forcibly closed, and we were relocated to a desolate place miles from fresh water. I grew up knowing a little about hunting and fishing, about poisonous plants and medicinal plants, but took this for granted. The white locals, as I found out later, knew about the dispersals, as they're called in Australia, of my people in the early 20th century. When I was about 17, I passed through that town on the way to see my grandmother further west, and an old white man standing on the shop veranda in Bollen recognised me. He said he knew that I was looking for my people and that they had been shot out by the native police, and I would find their bodies in trees to the north. That was 50 years ago. I've been told that my grandfather met my grandmother near Mitchell, another western town, and they married in the early 20th century on the Aboriginal reserve there. Both had been born in the late 19th century. My grandfather and his twin brother were born somewhere in the bush in central Queensland, and my grandmother somewhere in far southwest Queensland. My grandfather and his twin brother, Fred and Ted Waddy of the Iman people, were taken into the Bundalla Reserve for Aboriginals. After World War I, their population was struck by the Spanish flu, the pig swine fever that swept the world as the troops returned from the trenches in Europe. The victims at Bundalla were buried in 2 mass graves, and in the 1920s, the remaining population were forced marched to the Woorabinda mission. From there, my grandfather and his twin brother, both accomplished horsemen, were indentured to work for graziers. My grandmother, Ruby Waddy née Johnson, whose family travelled from station to station operating an outfit with well-trained working dogs doing rural labour, eventually became a station cook. She and her sister Teresa spoke a language that to me today sounds much like Bidjara or Yuwalarai, or one of those closely related languages that the people of the south-west of Queensland once spoke, but now mostly speak Bidjara. I recalled about 60 words of my grandmother's language in my 20s. Technically, like all other Aborigines in Queensland, I was a ward of the state under its legislation that was an iteration of the 1898 Protection of Aborigines and Prevention of the Sale of Opium Act. My story is not unique in Australia. There are hundreds of Indigenous cultures and their customs, and they vary greatly across the country. Their intellectual traditions have been transmitted over hundreds of generations. I'm just trying to figure out how to move that. Yeah. Oh, got it. Thanks. I'll take your jacket. Thank you. So this is the Gumbe First Languages map. And this is a community-driven project, and they've documented 750 varieties of language so far. There are 2 distinctive Indigenous cultural groupings in Australia, Aboriginal peoples on the mainland and most islands, and the Torres Strait Islanders, whose homelands are in the Torres Straits between the northern tip of Queensland and Papua New Guinea. People are believed to have settled on these islands about 20,000 years ago. The linguistic diversity of Indigenous Australia is immense, and although estimates vary according to the linguist and the method of reckoning, linguists in any case generally agree that there are more than 600 distinct language varieties or dialects, or 250 or more languages spoken across the continent. There is a very strong cultural association between language and land, which means that language relationships are specific. The threats to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures can be seen through the lens of language loss. Only about 120 languages are spoken today. Aboriginal people have been living on the mainland for more than 60,000 years. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of people living in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory 65,000 years ago. And this map shows conjectured pathways for the colonisation of Australia by Aboriginal people, with guesses of movements more than 30,000 years ago. And so you can see that the land bridges between New Guinea and Tasmania were still in existence at that time. And you can see in the grey areas the extent of the coastline of Australia more than 30,000 years ago, before the seas rose. Some archaeologists have conjectured that a site in Victoria shows evidence of people arriving there 120,000 years ago. The astonishing antiquity of human life on our continent has been estimated, as I say, at least 65,000 years. And this means that Aboriginal life here is the oldest continuous human culture on Earth. The history of humanity is less than 300,000 years old. Not only archaeological research, but also genetic research has revealed a great deal about the spread of our species, Homo sapiens, around the globe. The Aboriginal history of continuous occupation of Australia, or the continent, represents a fifth of the total of human history, and the evidence of it should be regarded as a world cultural and scientific treasure. The differences between cultures can be extreme, as we see with the very different Indigenous knowledge systems, ways of knowing about environments, the sky and its celestial bodies, weathers and seasons, medicine and healing, gender, and how our relationships with others are expressed through kinship, ritual and ideas. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures offer the world unique cultural ways. They've been mostly invisible throughout Australian history, misunderstood, denied, vilified and lied about. The price Aboriginal people have paid for being Aboriginal is incalculably tragic and an unwarranted loss of life. The frontier deaths, the discrimination and marginalisation and the stigmatisation is a part of the burden that our cultures carry. What is encouraging, though, is the extraordinary resilience of First Australians to maintain and carry on their cultures and tell the world about them. The increasing interest of scholars and scientists, historians, astronomers and others who have investigated our traditions tell us that there are people who prefer the facts over the mythologies. The mythology about First Australians is that we are trapped in the imaginary Stone Age and incapable of change. The facts show otherwise. First Australians have always been innovators, finding ways to create the longest living cultures on the planet through tumultuous periods of climate change, rising sea levels, radically altered environments, colonisation, and over a century of extreme violence and dispossession. Tonight I can discuss only a few aspects of the ways of knowing and being in the world of the First Australians. In 2006 I wrote the prologue for First Australians, the companion book to the award-winning 8-part television series on our history, produced and written by Rachel Perkins. I explained in the prologue how learning Australian history in school in Queensland more than 50 years ago was both painful and boring. I wrote, the occasional Aboriginal characters represented bore no resemblance to the people I knew and had grown up with. Gradually, there was a dawning realisation that I was seen by my teacher and classmates as one of those Aborigines. History for me was a terrible burden, because it was in this class that I learnt that people like me were hated, and that the only stories that were told about us provided a steady stock of evidence about our supposedly shockingly violent tendencies, savagery, and most importantly, our innate tendency to steal and pilfer. When Rachel and I looked at how Australian history was taught in schools and universities in the past, we found that most textbooks made us disappear completely sometime in the 19th century. Or if the writers of those books did say that there were a few survivors, they wrote about these Indigenous people in ways that were dehumanising and disrespectful. They did not acknowledge our ancient and important history, but gradually the attitude started to change as new historians began to write our history. They estimated that of 1 million people, there were about 93,000 Aboriginal people living in 1901. What happened to the Aboriginal people of Australia? A few historians have asked this question, and for me, the answers are not surprising. At the University of Newcastle, a group of researchers led by Professor Lyndall Ryan are researching the frontier violence that has led to this terrible outcome for First Australians. They note, to dismiss the false notion of the First Australians as passive victims, that from the moment the British invaded in 1788, they encountered active resistance from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owners and custodians of the lands. In the frontier wars, which continued until the 1960s, massacres became a defining strategy to eradicate that resistance. As a result, thousands of Aboriginal men, women and children were killed. They have mapped the incidents of massacres of First Australians, their locations, timelines and information about the massacres in Central and Eastern Australia from 1794, when the first massacre was recorded, until 1930, but their research so far has not extended into Western Australia. Massacres that occurred after 1930 are not included, but will be covered in the next phase of the project. So on this map, you can see about 150 massacre locations, but the map's been revised and they've now documented 250 massacre sites, of those that can be found in the records. So their research relies on the records and includes only events for which sufficient information remains from the past and can be verified. The map also includes information about massacres of British colonists and others in Central and Eastern Australia in the same period. And so their findings are that massacres of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were typically carried out by hunting parties of soldiers, armed settlers, mounted police and or native police, with 6 to 40 men in each party, averaging 8 to 10 men. In Tasmania, from 1804 to 1834, soldiers, police, armed settlers, shepherds and stock keepers went on foot at night mainly. In Victoria, from 1836 to 1859, there were mounted police, native police, armed settlers and stockmen on horseback day and night. In New South Wales, from 1827 to 1900, mounted police, native police, armed settlers on horseback during the day. In Queensland, from 1859 to 1910, native police, armed settlers on horseback day and night. And so the list goes on. And amongst the weapons that were used were swords, pistols, muskets, bayonets, carbines, repeating rifles and strychnine poison. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's weapons were spears, waddies and hatchets. So I think I have a map of the, no I don't, sorry, but just to give you an indication of the numbers well, I won't actually, it's too complicated. But other factors that contributed to the rapid population decline, and these include disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, and starvation. So, at first implementing rationing to secure contract and trust, and later to prevent Aborigines from spearing cattle, the colonial administrators and settlers were forced to expand the distribution of rations with the onset of drought. With little choice but to congregate and wait for rations, Aboriginal people were drawn to the pastoral stations, where their food supply was materially, if intermittently, augmented by the refuse of the slaughter yard. So most locations therefore relied on government rations for some, if not all, of their subsistence. However, government rations were irregular and often inadequate. So surviving Indigenous populations became entangled in the new economy, which had supplanted their own. The assimilation policies that were formalised and entrenched in the state and territory governments of the 1940s meant that the role of Aboriginal labour fitted in with a caste system that operated throughout the British Empire. It had been imposed in India, Africa and elsewhere, and was used as the means of extracting labour cheaply. This system relegated people to categories such as servants, coolies, indentured labourers, controlled populations and others. In Australia, there could be no special arrangements with local chiefs or ruling families as it occurred under the Raj in India, or with the ruling aristocracies of Malaysia or elsewhere. As in most of the world's hunter-gatherer societies, leadership in Aboriginal Australia was situational. There were no chiefs or ruling hereditary elites that could press their populations into service for the plantations, slave trade and other economic ventures, as the colonists in British colonies elsewhere had done in order to maintain their privilege. Therefore, we have to look to the records of those who sought to understand Aboriginal people, and much of what is known about the first Australians during those times comes from their records, many of them detailed. Paintings, drawings and other illustrations also provide a window on Aboriginal life. What is often not understood is that these observers of Aboriginal life during colonial times were documenting the first Australians and their societies after the horrors of the colonial invasion, after the epidemics of disease that so greatly reduced Aboriginal populations, and when first Australians were being rounded up and confined to reserves and missions. Observers were committed to the ideas of the time about a racial hierarchy and regarded our people as members of inferior races. These ideas distorted their perceptions and their accounts, but in most quarters are no longer regarded as valid in the 21st century. The 19th century fashion for scientific racism had been discredited by reputable scientists. So they were observing people whose social and environmental worlds had largely been destroyed or permanently altered. This was especially the case in southeastern Australia, where the colonisers arrived first. They were not observing the lives of the first peoples as they had been before contact, but in most cases after the impacts of dispossession of their lands and cultural property, eradication of their economic ways of life, and largely reduced numbers. Illness, loss of family and way of life were rarely considered as factors in what was observed. And thus the records are often an untrue and derogatory reflection of the Aboriginal ways of life as they were originally. This is why the works of Bill Gammage and Bruce Pascoe are so important. They correct the false impression that early records of Aboriginal life give and inform Australians today about ways of life, social, economic and environmental, of the first Australians, and by carefully reading the literature show that Aboriginal people were highly knowledgeable and skilled in managing their environments and making a dignified and satisfying way of life economically from their resources. Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, Black Seeds recovers the reality of pre-colonial Aboriginal existence through a thorough examination of documentary evidence written by the very first people to encounter Aboriginal societies, well before the introduction of colonial farming practices that erased not only the people but their agriculture, their dwellings and their material culture. Pascoe extends the work of Gamage by expanding his scope beyond land management to include evidence of food production, methods, housing construction and even clothing. He says that in his research he came across repeated references to people building dams and wells, planting, irrigating and harvesting seed, preserving the surplus and storing it in houses, sheds or secure vessels, creating elaborate cemeteries and manipulating the landscape. And many examples of these are represented in rich detail in his book. One such example gives lie to the idea that Aboriginal people were merely passive consumers of the land, is that of grain production. He presents evidence that grain was grown and harvested, stored in sheds and then ground into flour for making bread. Pascoe's discovery of the details of this type of agricultural practice, along with yam and onion production, evidence of native grass management that promoted soft and fertile soil, aquacultural infrastructure and dwelling construction led him to the realisation, he says, that the hunter-gatherer tag was a convenient lie. This is the second theme of the book, through which Pascoe explores the reasons why the clear evidence of Aboriginal civilisation that clearly demonstrated land ownership in a way that could be understood through the British lens has been so comprehensively erased from Australia's national conscience. He describes how the detailed accounts of Aboriginal economies observed by the very first explorers and pastoralists failed to make it even to the second generation of white settlers, partly because of the newly introduced hard-hoofed animals quickly compacted and destroyed all beneath their feet, while villages were burned to the ground, but also partly because of what he calls cultural amnesia. This was necessary to legitimise the wholesale theft of the Australian continent. Pascoe explores this latter imperative in some detail, explaining how and why the belief in the nomadic hunter-gatherer lie was so successfully adopted. His book aspires to introduce an important shift in perspective when examining Australia's pre-colonial past and its people, and a new respect for its Aboriginal civilisation. Bruce, by the way, is a Bunurong man from the Melbourne region. Bill Gamage, a famous Australian history who wrote The History of the Anzacs, explains in his book, The Biggest Estate on Earth, that the Australian continent that the British encountered in 1788 was no wilderness, but rather a managed series of landscapes, much of which looked like, to use his phrase, a gentleman's park. In his detailed study of the historical records, scientific literature, paintings and images pertaining to Aboriginal use of the land and vegetation, he writes that the Aboriginal people created a continent-wide system of land management. And he writes in detail about Aboriginal fire management practices. Aboriginal fire management is an ancient and also contemporary practice with ancient origins that altered the Australian landscape. Whereas European settlers deemed the continent a wild and unfamiliar environment, what they encountered was in fact a landscape that had been very consciously and deliberately shaped by fire for millennia. Scientists from a range of disciplines concerned with ecology and the environment have shown how Australian landscapes were shaped by Aboriginal fire practices. Aboriginal peoples used fire to promote and distribute plant communities, such as grass or open forest, and sought to distribute trees and plants to promote and protect animals, birds, reptiles and insects. By using fire as an intrinsic part of land management, our people have managed the wildfire-prone Australian landscapes. This kind of knowledge is critical to understanding what life was like for the people who lived on our continent over the past 65,000 years. As researchers and scientists come to terms with these impacts, they've been forced to ask the question, what do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know about the places they've inhabited for very long periods of time and the life forms that they cohabited with during these periods? Modern knowledge of the prehistory and archaeology of regions such as Australia has advanced spectacularly in the last decade, especially because of advances in dating techniques such as radiocarbon dating and thermoluminescence. Here are a few examples of what we know from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who preserve the ancient knowledge through stories, songs and symbols, and a few examples of the many discoveries made so far by scientists, geographers, archaeologists, prehistorians and others who look beyond the surface into the substrata or into the skies to understand the deep past. Did you know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people paid careful attention to unexpected phenomena such as eclipses and meteorite impacts and could determine the cardinal points to an accuracy of a few degrees? Or that Aboriginal Australians discovered the variability of Betelgeuse and made observations of red giant variable stars? Ray Norris and Dwayne Hummaker, both astronomers, have led research to document how the traditional cultures of Aboriginal Australians include a significant astronomical content perpetuated through oral tradition, ceremony and art. And this astronomical content includes a deep understanding of the motion of objects in the sky. It was used for practical purposes such as constructing calendars. And there is also evidence that traditional Aboriginal Australians made careful records and measurements of cyclical phenomena. They have unearthed this knowledge from the historical records and worked with knowledgeable elders to develop an extraordinary project that includes Indigenous astronomers and astrophysicists. With this knowledge, Indigenous people are able to read the weather and climate for food propagation, predict changes in the environment in relation to seasons, weather patterns and the behaviour of plants and animals, harvesting, hunting and gathering, navigating across the land and the sea by the stars, the moon and the sun, and organising social and ritual life. Their work casts new light on the depth of traditional Indigenous knowledge. And this knowledge is a living part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and continues to evolve. Through the sharing of these practices, all Australians can better appreciate the depth, wealth and diversity of our astronomical knowledge and its contribution to our national identity. Stories have been handed down from ancestors, and these stories help us to understand the past. Some researchers are changing the conventional and often mistaken, unfounded and biased narratives that universities have taught. So let's turn to the Aboriginal knowledge of the rising sea levels. Stories belonging to Australian Aboriginal groups tell of a time when the former coastland of mainland Australia was inundated by rising sea level. Geographers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reid examined stories from 21 locations that you can see on this map from every part of the coastline. They found that in most instances it is plausible to assume that these stories refer to events that occurred more than about 7,000 years ago, the approximate time at which the sea level reached its present level around Australia. The stories they investigated provide evidence that supports the scientific understanding of post-glacial sea level rise. They calculated in all cases the minimum water depth below the present sea level needed for the details of the particular group of local area stories to be true. They then compared these calculations with the sea level envelope for Australia and maximum and minimum ages for the most recent time that these details could have been observed. They concluded that this method of dating Aboriginal stories shows that they appear to have endured since 7,250 to 13,070 calendar years before the present. In other words, by comparing the details in the stories with scientific investigations, they have shown that traditional owners have told these stories for more than 7,000 years. The stories are of two types: ordinary stories and sacred mythology. The map shows the 21 places where the ancient stories told of coastal inundation and the extent of the land and the shape of the continent during the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. The stories tell of places that were drowned when the seas rose. For instance, in what is now Port Phillip Bay, where Melbourne is located, it is believed that the bay and the sea dried out 2,800 to 1,000 years ago after sediment blocked its entrance. Today, the entrance to the bay is regularly dredged to allow shipping access to Melbourne. It is also possible that the stories refer to an earlier inundation event, and these stories come from William Hull in evidence to the Victorian Legislative Council, who stated that the Yarra and coast tribes say that their progenitors recollected when Hobson's Bay or Port Phillip Bay was a kangaroo ground. They say plenty catch kangaroo and plenty catch opossum there, and that the River Yarra, which winds its way through Melbourne, once went out at the heads, but then the sea broke in and Hobson's Bay, which was once a hunting ground, became what it is. Indigenous knowledge and traditions were essential for survival in this continent's changing environments. Creating the conditions for sustainable human societies meant having an encyclopedic understanding of the past and the present, the geography and potential food and water sources and other material needs, travel routes and much more. Nunn and Reid put it this way: in Aboriginal society, great store is placed on the learning of traditional knowledge, while the geography of the land is taught systematically to new generations, locally through stories about country and totems held within patrilines, and on a larger scale through songs that describe songlines, records of ancestral beings crossing the land, performing creative acts that place totemic sites and language and people into the landscape. It is therefore unsurprising that many Aboriginal traditions appear to have endured longer than the notional limits of 500 to 800 years for orally transmitted knowledge. Even so, most Australians are unaware that the natural and cultural environments of vast regions of our country are still today stewarded and cared for by an Aboriginal workforce. An extraordinary example is the work of the members of the Gunditjmara Aboriginal Corporation in southwest Victoria. Budj Bim is the home of the Gunditjmara people. They have managed this remarkable environment for thousands of years. Their land management agency, Gunditjmara, has developed a master plan for the Budj Bim National Heritage Landscape, and this map is an historical map that shows only a small part of it. The landscape was created by volcanic lava flow. Mount Eccles, or Budj Bim, exploded 30,000 years ago. And the landscape was created by the volcanic lava flow and extends to the sea and encompasses a series of waterways, including Lake Condah and the Fitzroy River. It is a unique place with universal heritage-based values that demonstrate how Gunditjmara people worked with the natural resources and environment of the region to establish a permanent place of human society over the past 30,000 years and beyond. The landscape includes engineered wetlands and channels used to hold and harvest eels, the oldest known record of aquaculture in the world. So far, the Gunditjmara people have gained agreements and title to over 60 hectares, including management rights over the land and the waterways. Prehistorian Dr. Ian McNiven at Monash University and many others have worked with the Gunditjmara people to document their preservation and restitution of this remarkable cultural heritage. Their work has revealed that these large-scale fishing facilities and associated aquaculture ponds rupture traditional representations of Aboriginal people as simply hunter-gatherers. Rather than living passively off whatever nature provided, the Gunditjmara actively and deliberately manipulated local water flows and ecologies to engineer a landscape focusing on increasing the availability and reliability of eels. And this manipulation involves stone structures such as traps and channels, so far dated back to at least 6,600 years, eel aquaculture facilities, ponds, dam walls, channels that predate contact with Europeans by many hundreds and possibly thousands of years. As archaeologist Harry Larandos pointed out more than 3 decades ago, and Bruce Pascoe reveals in Dark Emu, differences between hunter-gatherers and cultivators and foragers and farmers are far more complex and blurred than we once thought. This landscape provides an outstanding example on a world scale, on a world stage, of the scale, complexity and antiquity of a well-preserved Aboriginal fishery that continues into the present. And it is an exceptional example of Aboriginal environmental manipulation and management. As McNiven tells the story, misunderstandings began with an 1841 expedition to southwest Victoria by the Chief Protector of Aborigines, George Augustus Robinson. On July 9, 1841, to the north of Gunditjmara country at a swamp near Mount William, Robinson reported an immense piece of ground trenched and banked, resembling the work of civilised man, but which on inspection I found to be the work of the Aboriginal natives, purposefully constructed for catching eels. Robinson estimated that the system of channels measured some thousands of yards or 2 kilometres in length and covered an area of at least 15 acres or 6 hectares. His findings were not what early settlers of the colony wanted to hear. Colonial settlement was about removing nomadic savages, not tillers of the land. The evidence was either ignored or as an inconvenient truth, or dismissed as evidence of irrigation by a superior race of cultivators living in Australia prior to the coming of the Aborigines. There are many such mythologies. It took another 135 years for more appreciative European eyes to examine the scale and complexity of this Aboriginal fishery. In the 1970s, Dr. Peter Cootes of the Victorian Archaeological Survey carried out site surveys at Lake Conda, or Te Rak, the centrepiece of the Budj Bim cultural landscape. The lake is very different to the marshy plains near Mount William. It is a rugged lava flow terrain of basalt rises, swampy depressions and waterways formed as a result of the eruption of Budj Bim at least 30,000 years ago. And this is a map of what they found. And that is what the local Gunditjmara people had long known about: an extensive Aboriginal fish trapping system comprising hundreds of metres of excavated channels and dozens of basalt block dam walls constructed over innumerable generations before European contact. Cootes estimated that the volume of basalt blocks moved measured in the many hundreds of tonnes. Harry Larandos investigated these fish traps and their stone houses, and he was the first person to use the expression eel farms. So this extraordinary aquaculture system is the largest known in Australia and possibly the world. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have continued our traditions of caring for country in many ways. And as I say, the most important today is the Indigenous workforce of environmental carers who manage Indigenous land and waters. And that is a picture of Lake Conda with its rugged basalt flow. But that is some 80 years after the farmers destroyed it and turned it into sheep paddocks. It's been restituted by the Gunditjmara workers. But let's turn now to this map. This is a map of Indigenous protected areas. donated, well, not donated, but allocated by the Aboriginal traditional owners to conservation, natural heritage and cultural conservation. And the workforce itself consists of 123 Indigenous ranger groups across Australia, and these employ 839 Indigenous rangers in full-time positions. The recognition by some governments of Australia, but the Commonwealth in particular, of these ancient knowledge systems has led to a greater awareness of the need to involve Indigenous people in protecting our natural resources. So our people are concerned, like people elsewhere, to promote and maintain their active involvement in the pursuit of environmental security and sustainable economic livelihoods, and use a variety of legal and practical methods to do so. One is this system of Indigenous protected areas, largely invented by traditional owners, and there are now 75 dedicated Indigenous protected areas across approximately 67 million hectares, and these account for more than 45% of the National Reserve System's total area. So we're more than pulling our weight in environmental conservation. When the planning framework, the reserve framework, was drawn up by the government was forced to recognise the fact that in some instances, such as under the provisions of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal people owned whole bioregions. So in the Territory, Aboriginal people own more than 50% of the landmass and over 80% of the coastline. And these are not subject to high density settlement or degradation of natural values by industries. They are high integrity areas, both in terms of their natural and cultural values. And they remain subject to Indigenous management systems. So this new category of Indigenous protected area, which is supported by the International Union of Conservation Networks and international law, and also now government policy, has resulted in, as I say, 65 million hectares and a growing environmental workforce, paid environmental workforce, implementing traditional knowledge systems to care for the land. The Australian Indigenous Protected Area Program may offer some critical ideas for the development of community-oriented protected areas elsewhere. They can, if they involve adequate recognition of the relevant political and economic rights and interests of Indigenous peoples and local communities, play a role in the maintenance of the biodiversity-related knowledge systems of these groups, and by extension secure their capacity to control an economically sustainable future through both customary subsistence activities and the negotiated development of their resources within the market economy. I don't have time to talk about it, but one of them is carbon trading. So I'll declare a special interest. I'm on the board of the Aboriginal Carbon Fund, and last year we were able to pay out to traditional owners who burn their country traditionally and measure the carbon emissions, over $1 million resulting from trading their carbon units. Where there is the political and legal will to recognise, support and engage with Indigenous governance structures in the protection of biodiverse ecosystems, there are potentially a myriad of positive outcomes for both conservation and sustainable economic and cultural livelihoods. An IPA can only be achieved where Indigenous people have exclusive title to their land, however. So these are places where basic subsistence activities continue or are predominant or form a significant part of their economic activities. And so their traditional biodiversity-related knowledge traditions and applications are essential to safeguard food security and the provision of other basic economic and cultural needs. Australia, unlike other former British colonies, has no treaty with its Indigenous people. Customary systems of law predate the arrival of the British by many thousands of years and survive, often in highly adapted forms, in many parts of post-colonial Australia. Native title recognition in Australia is only 25 years old. This is in contrast to other common law jurisdictions, such as New Zealand, where native title has been recognised for at least 150 years. So New Zealand has a superior legal and political regime for recognising and dealing with Indigenous systems of law and governance, as compared with the Australian jurisdiction, in part because of the treaty rights negotiated in your colonial period. In Australia, for more than a decade, Indigenous leaders have sought the agreement of successive governments to hold a referendum to change the Australian Constitution to recognise our people and our cultures. It was Gumatj clan leader Galarrwuy Yunupingu who gave form to this existential crisis in Australia facing all the First Peoples. As leader of his clan in North East Arnhem Land, he presented the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd with a petition in 2008 for Australia to recognise the right of the Yolngu clans to exist and to be acknowledged in the Constitution. And I'll read it. We, the United Clans of East Arnhem Land, through our most senior Dilak, which as I understand it translates to your hapu, do humbly petition you, the Prime Minister of Australia, in your capacity as the first among equals in the Australian Parliament and as the Chief Advisor to Her Majesty, to secure within the Australian Constitution the recognition and protection of our full and complete right to our way of life in all its diversity, our property being the lands and waters of East Arnhem Land, economic independence through the proper use of the riches of our land and waters in all their abundance and wealth, control of our lives and responsibility for our children's future. His call was taken up by other Aboriginal leaders, including myself, and eventually a process of consultation and research resulted in this elegant statement, agreed to by a unanimous vote of 250 Indigenous leaders at Uluru in Central Australia, one of our most sacred and iconic places. The National Indigenous Constitutional Convention in 2017 agreed on an approach to being included in the nation in an honourable way and set this out in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The Australian Government did not agree to this approach, issuing a cursory statement in November 2017. This rejection is just another in a long history of disappointments, but Indigenous leaders remain committed to pursuing this goal, just as their forebears did. You may have noticed that it's become a political issue in Australia during this election period. Noel Pearson refers to this predicament as fragmentation, the legacy of settler colonialism that created similar grievances around the world, capturing pre-existent peoples in the imperial grasp and denying their right to exist. He states that there are four focuses of grievance: identity as a people, the territorial lands of a people, language and culture. People hold hard to these four things, he wrote. He asked the crucial question, so the problem of the world is, how do 10,000 distinct peoples live well and prosper and get along well with each other within 200 nation states? His answer is this: there is surely no future in hoping the nation states will further fragment, so that more nations can be created which reflect the existential convictions of distinct peoples. The existing nation-states, jealously guarding their integrity, have no appetite for further fragmentation. But it is also surely clear that nation-states denying the existence of distinct peoples within their territories and insisting upon the integrity of the unitary state without recognition of distinct peoples and cultures is no solution either. Insisting on comprehensive assimilation as the concomitant of nationalism is not the recipe for unity within nations. It foments too much ethnic destruction and resistance. There is an alternative to fragmentation and the assimilatory state. It is recognition and reconciliation, where peoples within nation-states come to terms with each other and commit to the nation while respecting the existential anxieties of distinct peoples. An essential part of the process of realising a concept of the nation of Australia that is based on 65,000 years of human society and not just 240 years is recognition of the Indigenous knowledge systems, which I've outlined to you tonight, and the role that our knowledge holders have played in stewarding Australian environments through radical changes, including an ice age, the rising of the seas and colonisation. I want to ask you to read this statement, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It captures the aspirations of the first Australians and our plan for survival and our ways of thinking and being, and a hope for the reconciled nation, a reconciled nation that has come to terms with its history and our existence. The statement reads in part, "We gather that the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years. Thank you for listening to me.